Hi, I'm Brad Beaton. I'm the father of 6 Collins Hill High School graduates. At Collins Hill, most of my children were required to read a book of communist propaganda by Howard Zinn titled A People's History of the United States, and to pass a test on that book as if it were true. Over the decades, many hundreds of thousands of students have been required to read that communist propaganda in public schools, but now America is awakening to that betrayal. I propose that wherever the Zinn or 1619 communist propaganda exists, those books should be accompanied by Dr. Mary Grabar's books, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America, and Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America. Dr. Grabar was a professor of history at Emory University, and other renowned historians and reviewers wrote, Zinn was a lifelong communist, and Dr. Grabar exposes Zinn's treasonous life and refutes his dishonest, malignant, and ignorant work. And Zinn's book is a pseudo-history full of mistakes, lies, half-truths, and smears. Dr. Grabar wrote a one-page summary of the 17 most outrageous lies in Zinn books, and I have many copies of those if anybody here would like to have a copy. In my opinion, these lies form the basis for every critical approach that pits men against women, indigenous against newcomers, blacks against white, rich against poor, and so forth, which is the typical communist approach. Here are a few of Zinn's 17 lies that Grabar debunks. Lie: Christopher Columbus was a greedy Christian capitalist who committed genocide on the gentle Arawak Indians for gold. Lie: the founding fathers were money grubbers who set up a system of government to exploit the lower classes. Lie: the United States was and is the most racist place in the world because of capitalism. Lie: American women had the same status as slaves. Lie: communists were the only ones who cared about the civil rights of African Americans. Lie: most African Americans wanted violent protest, approved of radicals like the Black Panthers, and liked the communists. A month ago, I asked Dr. Hunter and others to report the extent to which this critical race, critical class, critical gender, critical X theory is used in our taxpayer-funded public schools. Again, I propose that wherever the Zinn or 1619 communist propaganda books exist, those books should be accompanied by Dr. Grabar's books, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America.
Hello everyone, this is Bill Griffin and welcome to the Different Take Podcast. Really appreciate you watching. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, and comment. And today I want to talk about a book that is used in many high school and college history classes, and it's called A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So this book is a very long-winded opinion article by Howard Zinn. It is a diatribe against anti-capitalism through and through. That is the sole purpose of this book. He's been criticized by Dr. Mary Grabar in her book called Debunking Howard Zinn. I'll talk about her criticism a little bit later on. But I'd like to start off by, I want to talk about some excerpts in the book, but I want to start by introducing you to Howard Zinn. This is him talking about communism.
If you separate communism from the Soviet Union and from those bureaucratic and totalitarian countries that call themselves Marxists or communists and just treat communism as it was envisioned by Marx and Engels, that is ultimately a society where there'd be a freedom of the individual and a rational use of the world's resources. Well, that's something to take from communism. From socialism, I would take what I just described, and that is the use of the government, of a democratically elected government, to equalize resources and help people.
If you have individual economic freedom, which he's against. But if you do have individual economic freedom, it is impossible to rationally use the resources of the world. So you wonder, who are these people that will make the decision? If we can't have individual freedom, who are these people that will do this? And it's never worked. It's only led to millions of people dying and suffering whenever it's been tried. But yet Howard Zinn is a true believer. It must be great to go through life and always be right when you never have to prove yourself, because this thing you're talking about has never happened before. In recorded history, has there ever been a situation where people have, what is the definition of rational use? But is it in the history of the world, has this ever happened where there were the people in charge of making this decision, or the people that make these decisions? How do they decide who gets what? Howard Zinn's also a big believer in that there shouldn't be borders and passports and all this kind of stuff. I want to talk about some excerpts in the book. This is from page 355. And I cut off this a little bit, but this is during the period 1921 to 1927, I assume, because he doesn't say. But it says the general level of wages for workers rose. Some farmers made a lot of money. The 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy new gadgets: autos, radios, refrigerators. So I find this very interesting that Howard Zinn refers to autos, refrigerators, and radios as gadgets. So the Merriam-Webster's definition is as follows as to the word gadget: an often small mechanical or electronic device with a practical use, but often thought of as a novelty. So he technically, I suppose, he's correct in the first part that cars or autos, refrigerators, and radios have a practical use, but they're not thought as novel. They're not thought as novelties. I'm sure during this period in the 1920s, these things weren't thought as novelties. But his choice of words implies to me that this is a novel thing and it'll somehow wear off, or at least that's what the people thought. I don't think people were thinking that back then. I think they were thinking these are tremendous inventions. They were sought and changed the world. But Howard Zinn refers to them as gadgets. I suspect the reason he chose this word is to belittle the fact that corporate America, in his view, is evil, and it's really going to be impossible to make these items without some pretty significant capital investment and equipment so that you can make enough of them that they were affordable. Everybody could have them and that they were affordable. So that sounds pretty amazing, doesn't it? That these things were invented and used back then. And but he refers to them as gadgets. Quite strange. Another excerpt comes from 357. He idolizes, or I should say, ionizes communists in this book. This excerpt from page 357, communists again played a leading part in the great textile strike that spread through the Carolinas and Tennessee in the spring of 1929. So of all the problems that was happening in 1929 and 30 that started occurring, this was an important incident. And there are many of these incidents. He picks out incidents and then he talks about how, such as a strike, and how terrible that is for that their workers were treated unfairly, and because the capitalists are evil and greedy and so forth and so on. This is the common theme that goes through this book through and through. As an example, 375, only the radicals made an attempt to break the racial barriers. Socialists, Trotskyists, communists, most of all. So these were the important figures of the time, in Zinn's opinion. They were the ones that were the moral, the righteous, and so forth and so on. He refers to Gerald Ford as a conservative Republican. who had supported all of Nixon's policies. These are not considered conservatives. They're considered quite moderate. And Nixon is very responsible for the inflationary period beginning, some of the things that he did, which I've talked about in another episode. And of course, they both were exacerbated the problem of inflation with this constant doing anything that they could to avoid shrinking the money supply, because they knew that would probably throw the country in a recession. So that was put off and put off and put off, and went through about a 10-year period. But yet he calls them conservatives, implying that they are true believers in free markets, and not as much as Reagan. No, I don't think so. Or Donald Trump, for that matter. And in fact, Zinn really doesn't talk about inflation very much in this book. And who does inflation hurt the most? People on fixed income or people with low incomes. In page 519, in fact, he says, inflation, the apparent inability of the country to solve its economic problems, and a foreboding that the energy crisis will mean a permanent step backward for the nation's standard of living. This is, he's referring to the inflationary period in 1970s. He doesn't explain what the true cause of what inflation is, which is the expansion of the money supply. That's how you get it. He also, because this book was written in 1980, and he buys into the fact that energy resources at the time were far, far greater than was thought of. During the Carter administration, I think Jimmy Carter predicted that the world's supply of oil was going to run out now. And we have ample supply for many years at the current rate that the world's using. On page 526, he writes, this is during the mid-'80s, he writes, on the leading political forum on public television, the nightly McNeil-Lehrer report, the public was uninvited except as viewer of an endless parade of congressmen, senators, government bureaucrats, experts of varied kinds. Okay, I'd like to stop there for a second. I don't know what he means by uninvited. And he's also saying the leading forum on public television. I don't think the McNeil-Lehrer report was remotely close to the other television news broadcasts that were on the air, and they covered a lot of ground. I know they're leftists and they lie, and they were lying back then about many things, but the ABC, CBS, NBC, when we talk about television, was far greater market than the McNeil-Lehrer report. So I don't know why he's bringing that up. This parade of people, they're part of the public in the United States. So when he says the public, who knows what he's talking about there? It's a poor choice of words, but he uses it later, as I'll show. The second paragraph, on commercial radio, the usual narrow band of consensus, excluding fundamental criticism, was especially apparent. In the mid-1980s, with Ronald Reagan as president, the fairness doctrine of the Federal Communications Commission requiring airtime for dissenting views was eliminated. By the 1990s, talk radio had perhaps 20 million listeners treated to daily tirades from right-wing talk show hosts with left-wing guests uninvited. That is amazing, because what he's trying to do is mislead people deceive people into thinking that left-wing hosts couldn't have their own radio shows. The reason that there were no their market would have been, listenership would have been very small, is because nobody wanted to listen to them. And that continues to this day. They have very small ratings on talk radio with left-wing people. So he's trying to say that somehow in the 1980s, when this fairness doctrine was eliminated, that dissent was eliminated. And what that implies is that the government was censoring leftists. No, the public, they know it's Marxist ideology is not something that will work. It hasn't worked, and they don't want to hear, they don't want to listen to it. And that's as simple as that. But not according to Howard Zinn. On page 540, he says, unemployment grew in the Reagan years. In the year 1982, 30 million people were unemployed, all or part of the year. Look, the reason people were unemployed is because the country was thrown into a recession, because at the end of the Carter years, you had interest rates that were catastrophically high. We're talking about 18% to take a loan out to buy a house. The reason there was unemployment was because the money supply had to shrink, and the interest rates were the tool to do that. But he doesn't talk about that here. He's just talking about how the greedy capitalist wouldn't spend money on government programs. Well, that's the whole thing. That's what caused the problem to start with. He doesn't talk about that. And my last excerpt is from page 599. This is during the Clinton years. He says, all this at a time when the middle class is increasingly insecure economically. The system, he's talking about the capitalist system, in its irrationality, it's irrational. Communism is rational. Has been driven by profit to build steel skyscrapers for insurance companies, while the cities decay to spend billions for weapons of destruction and virtually nothing for children's playgrounds, to give huge incomes to men who make dangerous or useless things, and very little to artists, musicians, writers, actors. Capitalism has always been a failure for the lower classes. It is now beginning to fail for the middle classes. Okay, this was written, I guess, 20 years ago. It was a new edition came out or something. I'm not really sure. But he's talking, first off, in the 90s, there was a big push to close military bases. So and you could argue that, yes, too much money the United States does on weapons of destruction. That's an argument that a lot of people are willing to talk about. But in the Clinton years, what was happening was they were trying to get, it was one of the few times in our history where we were really trying to get spending under control. Republican legislature in Clinton went along with those type cuts and so forth, budget cuts. The interesting thing about this passage, he says, very little to artists, musicians, writers, and actors. What in the world was he living in then? There are many artists, musicians, writers, and actors that are very well paid in that period of time, before and after. So I don't know what his definition of little means. The book is filled with these passages trying to explain how capitalism is evil. That's what the book's about. Many ideas or stories that he pulls and statistics and so forth, they're cherry-picked to do the best job he can at proving how evil capitalism is. As I said at the beginning, this book is used as required reading in high school and college classes. This is a video of a parent at a Gwinnett County School Board meeting in 2022 talking about this book. And this is a video of a former teacher in the Gwinnett County Public Schools who is now running for school board in 2022. His name is Tony Sellers, and he expresses fondness and pride in using Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States as required reading in his class.
We pull in outside resources like things like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States that gives voice to, I guess you would call it, powerless whites, African Americans, Latinos. He talks about regular people rather than the typical hero myth or hero type or political history of the United States. So
Mr. Sellers, a former high school teacher, thinks that The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn is a good idea to teach in his class. Here's a couple of things that Howard Zinn and also this gentleman, I think, miss. The people in Howard Zinn's book, the oppressed peoples, the capitalists are the oppressors, and then you have the oppressed people. They may not view themselves as oppressed at all. In fact, the majority of them may aspire to become capitalists. Of course, Howard Zinn and maybe this fellow would think, well, of course they would aspire to become the oppressors. But no, they may not view themselves as being oppressed. That kind of logic is, oh, well, they want to move into a better station of life because they want to avoid being oppressed. They might not view their lives as oppressed whether they move out of that station or not. And of course, it would say, well, some of them some of them may view themselves as being oppressed. Not everyone would think that way. The second thing is this kind of really nutty idea that communists don't oppress people. Only the capitalists oppress people. Well, of course, that's not in this book. Now, is it? And you go through and see if you can find it. You won't. It's opinion, straight through and through. It doesn't belong in any sort of history classroom in a high school or college. It's okay to be in a library, but it ought to be down in the fiction section where there's books on witchcraft and sorcery and black magic and mythology and that sort of thing. It shouldn't be in the nonfiction section or the history book section. So as I said before, Dr. Mary Graybar wrote a book called Debunking Howard Zinn. I've seen this review, which is written by Stephen Frankel. I think that's how you pronounce that. Xavier University. He writes something very interesting about this book. He says, quote, Zinn's textbook survey of people's history of the United States was published in 1980 and received a cool reception in the academic community. Scholars on both the left and the right challenged its credibility and suggested that it distorted the facts in pursuit of a political agenda. He goes on to write Zinn's account, Christopher Columbus, is very grim, and that this allowed him to tell the story of the discovery of the New World as part of a broader tale of European exploitation and brutality, which of course would extend to the United States. He says Graybar shows that Zinn simply lifted his account from a high school history textbook by his fellow anti-war colleague Hans Koning. No wonder academic historians were unimpressed with Zinn's work. This account that I'm referring to is the account of the European destruction of the Indians by Christopher Columbus. That is one problem with this book that Graybar goes into some detail about. He also claims things such as Graybar points out that he claims that Frederick Douglass is anti-American. That is not true. His writings certainly do not reflect that. Frankel also writes regarding Graybar's book, Zinn always interprets the high in the light of the low. With exceptional consistency, Zinn definitely reduces every claim to justice or nobility in American history to a crude power or profit grab. Again, as if this wouldn't happen or couldn't happen in a much larger scale with a Marxist government. Whether you believe or want to even dig into whether Graybar debunks Howard Zinn, when you read it, he's clearly pulling out things that support his anti-capitalist ideology. That's really all the book is about. It's opinion that's not backed up. The experts that I read, the few excerpts I read, demonstrate that. It's opinion after opinion after opinion. It's not a history textbook. You should pay. Don't bother reading it. It's kind of, as I said, it's just a dumb book, and you shouldn't pay any attention to it. But the shame of it is there's so many high school teachers and college teachers that have read this stuff and they believe it, and so they're passing it along, and which is all the more reasons why you really got to push your schools to get rid of this stuff, and also to get school choice. At any rate, that's my episode today. I could talk forever about this probably, but I really appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment. Episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Check out the platforms we're on. I really appreciate you watching.